So I'm so glad to have friendly friends on the phone while we have our first call.
Yay.
This is a great idea. Yeah.
Very exciting. Tiffany, where did this emerge from for you?
It emerged a long time ago. In the mid-'80s, I had been in theater, and I was really burnt out by the power dynamics and the oppressive nature of the organizations that I was in, looking for another way, something to help me feel balanced and whole. And I came to a form of East Asian medicine, which was all about being present in relationship. Mm-hmm. And so that started my journey from there. And, for 10 years, I practiced that form. And I learned that through teaching that practice and also through practicing it myself, I was developing as a human being. I became much more collaborative. I became much more compassionate, so that when people showed up, no matter who they were and how much I may in the beginning have criticized them or pushed them away in a way, as soon as I started practicing with them about 5-10 minutes into it, I was able to be with them and in a way which was transformed. Mm-hmm. So from there, I got really interested in how do I apply these embodied practices to organizational change and leadership development. And that then led into my doctoral research, where I worked with another embodied form, physical theater improvisation. And the reason that I liked working with that form was because it enabled me to look at a group level. What do we do when we're trying to all listen and collaborate together? And so that then enabled me to have a perspective of a larger group or an organization, and how do change agents facilitate change? What can that practice teach us about facilitating change? So that's what got me into it, and it's been a 30-year journey, and I feel like I'm just always learning, constantly learning. There's just so much to learn.
Right.
And as I operated as a CEO of Dreamfish, I also got away from my own grounded practices and embodied leadership. And then I got burnt out, and I realized, oh, wait a second, I need to go back to what I know works here. Mm-hmm. And so that has brought me back. So we'll go ahead and move to the slides. So this first picture actually is from an appreciative inquiry training project for consultants, where we used embodiment practices. Consultants could actually use these embodiment practices when they were doing an appreciative inquiry. An appreciative inquiry is a method that you use with a community, a nonprofit, or company that is helping people to tell appreciative stories about the organization or community. Embodied practices, by their nature, tend to be appreciative. They are relational. It's all about practicing in relationship. This is an example of that training. I asked you while you were interested in embodied leadership because there are many reasons why people come to this work, and we all have a different lived experience. And embodied leadership is all about learning to show up with whatever is going on for us in our embodied lived experience. And so it's really being true to ourselves and showing up with whatever is going on for us. And so embodied leadership is going to look different for each of us. If you go to slide 3, you'll see 4 pictures here, and here are some examples of embodied leadership in action. And they look very different. Responding to one another, reflecting and listening to each other, exploring, playing music together. So embodied leadership can look very different. If you go to slide 5, we're going to look at what is embodied leadership. There may be something in here that touches you. And in my journey, I have practiced several methods that come from these different areas. Performance, I was in theater for several years, performed in over 1,000 musical theater performances. I'm a Buddhist practitioner, and so I practice mindfulness practices, everything from walking meditation, gardening meditation, sitting meditation. I even, when I'm moving rocks from one end of my house to another, I treat that as a meditation. So there are many ways to practice. But each of these practices have their own cultural roots and worldview that are attached to them. One thing I want to point out is among the European and American practices, a lot of forms of somatics or embodiment practices have come out of physical therapy, movement rehabilitation, body work, and most recently animal-assisted intervention. So when you see work with horses and leadership, the use of a horse or the use of a dog as a co-facilitator enables an individual to be present in themselves and have a mirror that is able to reflect what's going on for them. It's another way of getting nonverbal feedback. There are many different benefits, but that's one of them.
That's helpful, Tiffany, because I've heard about it but have never really understood. I knew it was a cool new thing, but I didn't quite get it, and so that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for saying that,
it was
Tricia.
The animals I'm talking about. Yeah.
I'm studying animal-assisted interventions and looking at work with dogs because while I was working with groups of women, what I found was that they really wanted me to bring my dog. So as and I started to learn, what is it about bringing the dog? And so I started looking at canine therapy, and then I realized, there's so much work with leadership development in horses, but there hasn't been that work with canines. So that's a new interest of mine is, since most people have dogs but not horses,
right,
how can we also be in relationship with the dogs that are part of our lives and learn from that relationship? Anyway, that could get me off into a passionate tangent here. Let's go ahead and move forward. So slide 6, I just want to go back to these images again. So after kind of looking at the different cultures, here you can see the cultural origins also in these pictures. You have an African improvisation form in the upper left-hand corner. In the upper right corner, that is part of, an appreciative inquiry. Lower right-hand corner, that is improvisation. And clockwise, going to the left-hand corner, that comes out of a European movement practice, a dance form that teaches people about complex adaptive systems. So it has a lot of biology language in it. So let's go to the next slide, adopted in the social sciences. Understanding the field, for me, is very important. When I first went to college, I really didn't understand what were the different fields, and I felt embarrassed to ask. And I think that it is very common when coming into a new territory to not have a map, and also usually because different practices are promoting their own form. So it's hard to understand what's the bigger picture. So, that's driving me here and offering this. So in the social sciences, we have embodiment practices in psychology and in education and in sociology. And so one of the things that has been of interest to me is how to apply work from trauma therapy and stress reduction in small interpersonal dynamics groups. So when people are getting emotionally flooded because it's really scary to be in relationship, helping them to physiologically track what's going on and lower their heartbeat and their blood pressure, and physiologically track what goes on when they're feeling certain feelings. That all comes out of the skills that I've developed through embodiment practices. Movement-based expressive arts therapy. There's some wonderful work in Northern California by Tamalpa Institute that I highly recommend. And then training and development, lots of experiential learning has these origins in these cultural practices, although we never talk about them. The last thing I want to share here is around the sociology piece. Is in my doctoral research, the research I did actually was sociological. It was looking at understanding what the body has to teach us about knowledge. And the reason that I did that was because it's kind of this fuzzy thing, embodied leadership. There is such a lack of language and understanding of what is knowledge when we include the body. For me, it's been really important in my own learning journey to understand that better. Where I'm at now is applying that original research that I did then to the embodied leadership work. If you go to the next slide, slide 8.
Okay.
So what I'm showing you here is how we've progressed from the history and culture of the practices, then we've looked at how they've moved into the social sciences, and now we're looking at how they're being adopted in the applied social and behavioral science. And that is really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. That is where practitioners work to create change in communities and nonprofits and organizations. So the work has moved from its original cultural context, then into the social sciences, and now finally being applied in these different areas where we work. And so here you can see everything from community building, which Camille, I know you're involved in, and leadership development, Tricia, which you've been talking about, organization behavior, which is, for example, facilitating interpersonal dynamics groups and developing social emotional skills, organizational development, for example, the appreciative inquiry that I talked about. Very wide range of different ways to apply these different types of work. So I want to pause here, and I heard an affirmative from you, Camille. So, and I imagine you thinking, Tricia, so I want to ask if you have any questions.
If I look at community building, for instance,
right,
or leadership development, can you give me an example of how embodied, would be used there?
Great question. Yes, great question. So it's very helpful to have examples and stories. An example of community building that is an embodied approach, there was a nonprofit that had over 200 people in it. It was an organization that was filled with people that were very different from each other and had a lot of conflicts, differences in ages, cultures, perspectives. And I put together a group of facilitators who all had some background in embodiment practices. And what we did together was we brought the group together to practice making music improvisation together. We practiced movement in large groups, walking and stopping and turning the head. So large group improvisation where people were doing really simple movements, but they were practicing listening and responding to each other non-verbally. And did those practices together. Then we asked them to make drawings about what that experience was like being in community and collaborating together. and then after they made those drawings, had them make a community artwork out of that. So it started in movement. We had them make meaning of the movement and then put together a large piece of art. And then after that, they developed a performance, a community ritual together where they all walked into a spiral and then out into a circle, and each person said into the group what they were walking for. So they made a commitment to the group about some intention that they wanted for that organization. So that was an example of a project.
Very interesting.
Yeah, because the thing is that by helping people to access other ways of knowing besides words, it enables people to connect in a way that might be easier for them. Sometimes, for example, how it might be difficult to have a difficult conversation on the phone with somebody, but it might be much easier to take a walk with them on the beach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's what we're talking about. It's that being able to use embodied practices towards the goals that you want, and that might be everything from walking together, making art together. There's many different ways to be together physically that will move you towards the goals that you want.
So it's high touch. It's much more important now in this digital age where people are kind of removed from each other. And
absolutely. You're spot on, Camille. There's a lot of interest in mindfulness, improvisation, a lot of different physical practices that I see.
Yeah.
And I also experienced that the groups of women MBA students that I work with, every group has just loved the meditation practices that I use. I've just been really touched by how meaningful it's been for them.
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear. Yeah. Well, two things. One, I'd like to hear more about that, the mindfulness stuff that you've done. But the other thing that occurs to me is I'm imagining with groups that I work with, there'd be resistance to this. And so, ranging from, okay, I'll give it a try, to no effing way, this is too weird. And so it's like in terms of baby steps, looking at the organization, looking at the group, and where it's at in its development, and who the people are, and how you can introduce these concepts in a way that can be embraced based on where they're at. Does that make sense?
Yes, and my experience is that I rarely have resistance to introducing these practices, and I think that one it is about timing. It's really about listening to where the client is at, understanding where they're at, and introducing them when it's a response to something that they're asking for.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, it's not something you're pushing on them. It's like this is they're in a certain place and they need a solution, and this is in response to that.
Yes. So, for example, calling for a moment of silence is an embodiment practice. Stillness. It's the practice of stillness.
Yes.
For example, when a group is in some conflict or there's a lot of emotional flooding in the room so that it's hard for people to even think or to hear other people, calling for a moment of stillness allows people to slow down and to get cognitively back online.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so, or for example, sometimes, very often it will just be in the background of my mind, it may not be something that I tell the group that I'm using an embodied approach. I'll just simply say, why don't we take a break for 5 minutes? And knowing that this will give people the chance to physiologically to slow themselves down and come back from a place of resistance, trauma, flooding, basically to take care of themselves and be able to come back.
That's helpful. That's helpful. And I think, I meditate every day. And I'm always afraid with a group, particularly in a professional setting, that it's introducing something spiritual, it's introducing something that some people aren't going to want to go there, whereas the way you just framed it is more just creating an atmosphere where people can be, and not, when they are flooded, when emotions are charged. It just, the way you framed it made sense to me. I liked it.
The work is so much about being present with people and being in service of their highest good. And if we're in that listening frame of mind and simply bringing these practices and approaches in where they're of service. If you go ahead and go to slide number 9, I've listed a lot of different kinds of practices and a lot of different ways that they're applied. But there's some basic things about the assumptions behind embodiment methods. So there is goal orientation. So, for example, in doing diversity work, helping people create relationships across differences, I might have a goal of helping people slow down enough to hear each other. Right? So that would, so it's figuring out what is it I want to achieve with people, and then using a particular practice that I have to further that goal. The things that the embodiment practices have in common, it's all about being in relationship. And second, it is really listening, inquiry, meaning listening to the lived experience.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's why I was saying that I actually really don't have resistance very often if, in fact, I'm being present in the moment and really being with the lived experience in myself and with the people that I'm working with. And then finally, it's really about the whole self and whole people and influencing the whole system, whatever the system is that you're working with. And so one of the things that embodiment practices teach is really systems thinking. You really get it in your body when you're doing these different kinds of practices. You really get systems thinking. Even if you can't talk about it, you get it in your body. So it helps me to intuitively know what's the thing that I want to do, as a facilitator.
That's cool.
I'm remembering I went to a class of yours and Charlie Seashore at Fielding Institute. And I was one of those people who thought that would be weird, doing something physical. But after, I don't know, maybe it was a half hour, 45 minutes into the session, I remember the way you and Charlie got us into an exercise. It sounded like we were just going to stand up and stretch, which is always traditional thing in long meetings. But then you had us, before I knew it, so I was comfortable with it. Then we around in a circle, and then we broke up, and the circles got smaller and smaller and smaller, and to where we were almost bumping into people. So you felt you did in your body what happened when you were in a high-density situation and life was speeding up. But the way you segued into that, was very, very smart, I thought, because I didn't have time to get weirded out or frightened or anything like that.
That's great.
Yeah, it was just like a stretching exercise. It started out. Now, I understand now what you're talking about here. It was neat, and just like the moment of silence, just little baby steps. But that was it actually. My experience of that afterwards was it was really fun, and it was because I didn't feel pushed, and there were a lot of people like me in that class who had never walked around like that in circles. But it was fun, and then talking about it afterwards, what we learned, that was the inquiry. I'm seeing that in this inquiry into the lived experience. That was very enlightening.
Great.
That's a skill you develop, a way to kind of move people into their bodies from their minds. So it's like we're living in silos.
Sounds like you did a pretty good job.
Thank you. I think what I like about your story is that it illustrates a developmental approach. When you're trying to facilitate change, having a developmental approach where you're really listening to where people are at, meeting them where they're at, and helping them to make very small stretches. And so that slowly it's becoming and more complex, but you're really tracking where they're ready to move into. So it's in a sense following the people that you're working with. And so, by doing these practices, it really does help to understand in your body what is it like to be a change agent that is helping the group, helping a community or a nonprofit to do something that's scary, where they're taking risks.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to be intuitive. You have to, as the leader, as a facilitator, really kind of be aware and be able to change course and be able to adapt to what's happening.
Yes. If you go ahead and look at slide number 10, and what you see there is 3 different metaphors of what is development. And this is a graphic that is developed by my colleague Scott Bristol, who has developed a tool, and there's a URL at the bottom of the slide for that tool, Life Journey Map. And these are 3 different pictures of what development looks like. One is development is a journey, right? So Camille, you had a story, and in that story, you were describing a journey of starting off, small, and then, you got to a place where you were all having a conversation about what your lived experience was. And so then another way of looking at development is cyclical. You know how sometimes in life you keep returning back to the same thing over and over again, and when you return back, you have a whole new understanding of it. There are many East Asian practices where development has a more cyclical feeling to it. So, for example, when you practice breathing in meditation, it teaches about development that is cyclical, because you breathe in, you breathe out, you breathe in, you breathe out. And what happens in breathing in and breathing out is that we learn that after each breath, the world is different. We are different. Change is happening with each breath, right?
Yeah.
So just like that picture there of the circles or encompass each other, it's with each breath, change has already happened. Just with that breath, we'll never be the same. So. And then the third metaphor is development is seen differently, and I think that movement helps us to see the people that we're working with differently. It helps us to see our own experience. It helps us to see ourselves differently.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
If you go ahead and go to slide 11. And so here, we talked about improvisation, and we talked about mindfulness. So in that column on the left-hand side, you see martial arts, animal-assisted interventions, improvisation, mindfulness, sensory movement in nature, and there are more that I could put there: physical therapy, movement rehabilitation. So with each of those different approaches, if we look at what are the goals that we want for in the particular group or individual or organization that we're looking at, and then here are some samples of development goals on the right-hand side. And so you can see that different practices lend themselves to developing different values and competencies. And I just gave a sample here, just a few words, just so you can see that there are many flavors.
Now, what would be sensory? What's an example of sensory movement in nature?
Going on a very slow walk in nature, where as you're walking in nature, you're feeling the ground beneath your feet, smelling the air, letting your eyes move softly across the landscape to take things in, breathing softly as you walk, noticing the reactions that you have in your body as you walk, really taking in nature into your being, so that in a sense you're feeling this connectedness between breathing in nature, breathing out nature, walking on the earth and the earth supporting you.
Okay, and then under animal assisted, the word you have is you have listening, influence, and empathy. And what do you mean by influence?
There is a large body of work in leadership development that frames leadership in terms of influencing your community. And one of the things that working with horses or dogs can do is help you to understand, how do you practice influencing, and how is that working for you? So and a lot of that learning is how to create a healthy relationship, so that in fact you can have influence, right? So if you've ever had a dog that doesn't listen to you, right, there may not be enough trust in that relationship. So it's understanding what enables influence, and then being able to actually practice influence in that trusting relationship.
Yeah, so trust. You've got to develop trust to get the influence. True. I can see that in our local government. They're trying to create trust again. And that as they're doing that, they're getting more and more influence. I got it. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, that makes sense. I am going to pass the baton to Sabine, and we're right on track as well. We're on slide 12, and we're in the conversation of how our embodied leadership development goals developed.
Clearly by delicate connection, as you can see on that slide with the finger dance. And that leads us into the next slide, really on, well, what is being done, or what could you do, what could we be doing? That's slide number 13, and it's the first point. There's a little bit of a counterpoint to this beautiful, delicate contact we just saw on slide 12, because that's about, well, it's possible to practice alone. I mean, For example, of walking, breathing, meditation could be a solo practice. For example, if you had a turbulent meeting and you just have a hallway that you can use in a not-so-movement-friendly building. I've been seen to do some serious figure-8 walks after stressful facilitations. That would be a practice alone. Then there is training and practice in groups, whether it is training and practice the way you might see in Aikido, where certainly there's a lot of partnering and practicing, whether it's more improvisational things where having people to be responsive to and who also are lovely playing partners to surprise you is part of the practice. Coaching one-on-one could be an option where there is more specific, deeper work with sort of a role where somebody is more the specific facilitator of the other person who probably more specifically says, I am the learner here and I'd like some facilitated guidance. And then you might see the large group inquiry and social research. Well, we get together and really investigate. And we may use social research methodologies where in that line of thinking, often you're looking at research also as a change methodology where inquiring, researching, and experimenting can get blurry in interesting and fruitful ways. And language and storytelling in organization, the whole question of what stories are we telling, how, who tells whom, which stories, and also how can we mess around with these stories that they help us create openings into other possibilities. And of course that storytelling doesn't necessarily just need to be words. That can be words told in different rhythms. That can be words that translate into different performances and so on. And I'll pause here for a moment because that's a lot when we start absorbing the field of possibilities. So it's an invitation to just take a breath. And to listen to yourself listening and maybe each other listening. And questions that may have arisen from your listening or thoughts. What's coming up for you at this point? We're really looking at an emerging field here, which is drawing on these whole ranges of theories as well as practices and is pulling them together.
Hi, I apologize that I joined the call so late. So I'm just trying to catch up looking at some of the earlier slides. And one of the reasons that I've stepped away from full-time involvement in business to pursue movement studies is just seeing how disembodied people are in that environment. I'm really excited to kind of see what you're exploring here and how you're thinking of bringing that awareness to the business world.
I wonder, Sabine, if you could speak to Bev's curiosity about how you're bringing it to business world, and you're taking a deeper dive into applying movement language. Could you share about that?
Mm-hmm. Happily. So I empathize very much with you, Beth, on that observation, how disembodied most of business practice seems to be. That's a discomfort that started me into really going more fully into this realm a number of years ago. The other thing that I'm seeing is that movement is really not something that seems to even show up in language or in the way we know how to speak, not in wider society by and large, and in business maybe even less. So I am very curious and really wanting to include what is at a first layer quite an analytical language from Laban movement analysis. And I've been finding that it's been quite accessible to business people because some of them is like a continuous line with poles. And that's just, as a visual, familiar.
Yes.
Point A, point B, line in between, and then we start sort of moving along that line. So there is an analytical structure there that seems to provide a good entryway, and also it contains that idea that you're not allowed to think when you move, or you have to quit being an intellect when you move. I found that helpful, and then say, hey, and here's a language that you can use, and we don't just, land you in this unnamed woo-woo land of experience that you're supposed to be having or not.
Mm-hmm. So when you're saying that we don't use language and movement, could you give me some examples of where you think that's not occurring?
For example, on that page 12 slide, you see two people, you see hands and fingers, and you see one person's eyes and mouth relatively clearly. And a lot of people would just say, oh, that looks nice or friendly or off-putting or so not me, or they would maybe have a judgmental statement about what's going on as well. And the minute you really start asking, well, but what about the specific movement there? Can you describe that? Most of us would have almost no vocabulary. Or if you go into a room and the atmosphere is really weird, could you look around yourself and see things in the movement of people that would be part of creating that strange atmosphere? Not just go, this is weird or this is hostile, but to look at it in what is happening in the way people are moving here, and can I describe that? And generally, we're not trained to do that. We experience it, we also do it, but we don't really know how to speak it at all.
Okay, I'm following you now. Yeah, and in the business world, that's very foreign. But curiously, when I have had just some casual discussions with friends of mine in business about kind of my approach to wanting to bring about movement awareness, they've been very, very receptive, which was actually surprising. It's almost like once you encourage people to start using that lens, they suddenly start seeing all the potential for it. But until you point it out, it's not a way that they think of looking at things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the vocabulary is a challenge.
Yeah, it is, and it's funny because everybody moves all the time, and yet it is invisible to most of us without a language. And I think that's where introducing some language is really helpful. And then a lot of I could apply that here and there can unfold fairly quickly.
It enables a handbook to be able to be written.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Probably should be a chapter on body language.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how related this is, but one of the things that I've been sort of playing around with starting a lexicon, is to bring awareness to people of how much they're actually using movement language without realizing it in everyday speech. You know, even comments like, someone's got my back up, or he stuck his neck out. When you start pointing out those sort of common elements of speech, which when you examine them are actually referring to sorts of movement, I think that makes it a little bit more accessible to people as well. Not that it's a specific vocabulary, but people then suddenly realize those figures of speech are actually more than just a figure of speech. They do actually translate to physical movement or posture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the minute that door opens to noticing, you start seeing things everywhere.
If we go to slide 14, this is to continue the stance. Sabine and I are co-facilitating a 4-month inquiry and training on embodied leadership, and this is really participatory training. We're all in our learning journey around how do we practice embodied leadership in whatever the work is that we're doing in the world. And there are more details at that link on the slide, and if you're interested in participating, we would be delighted to talk with you, just to let us know. And we'll be back to have another conversation on August 20th. If you know anybody who might be interested to learn more about embodied leadership, we'll have another teleclass. I feel like we're at the beginning of a wonderful journey to be able to make embodied leadership practices more accessible, and I really appreciate the questions and ideas from everybody on the call today. And that's exactly what we I think is really important, is that we come together in mutual support and community to ask these questions together.
Thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate that.
I think it's really useful to kind of share ideas and feed off each other. And
thanks, Tiffany and Sabina. It was very helpful for me. So I'm going to experiment a little bit with it in my groups, and I'll let you know how that goes.
Oh, wonderful.
Lovely.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Thank you very much. And I guess now this is going to be at St. Mary's, this workshop?
Yes. St. Mary's College Leadership Center is sponsoring the course. It will be on campus. And the other thing to mention here is Sabine's doctoral research. Sabina, you want to share?
Sure. This is also part of my journey as a doctoral researcher, working on movement and change processes. For those who wish to participate in the training and inquiry, there will also be an additional offering in February, which is a day to come together if you want to, and really reflect on what's working, what's been learned, what's been the value of embodied leadership practice in your lives and context. That would be a way for me to bring more into the world of the value of this work and hopefully give it more and more voice and legitimacy.
We'll have day-long times together once a month, and then be in conversation online with each other in between those day-long intensives.
Okay,
and so there will be five days. The first weekend there will be 2 days, and then after that, October, November, December, there will be just 1 day. The whole training is participatory so that your questions, the questions of the participants, and what really is important to you in your life and work will then shape the practices that we do. We'll bring practices to teach that are in support of the questions that the group has. And I think we'll go ahead and sign off on the call. So I'm sending you all, in the spirit of movement, I'm sending you all a big hug.
Thank you. Big hug, too.
Thanks. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.